I recently had a chance to speak with Representative Marionette Miller-meeks from Iowa. We discussed gas prices and energy independence. Here's part of our exchange.
Congresswoman Mary Miller-Meeks, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Congresswoman, right now there's an energy crisis in Europe. We're hearing rumblings of that potentially happening in the United States going into the wintertime. Do you think this could be avoided?
Well, absolutely, it could have been avoided, and this started with policies from President Biden the day he was inaugurated, when he canceled the Keystone Pipeline, hasn't had auctions for leases on federal land, and hasn't allowed permitting even when there is an energy company that has an auction. You all are very used to energy production in southwestern Pennsylvania where we are, and in Iowa we have a huge renewable energy portfolio. 50% of our energy is from renewables, and we export energy as well.
Speaking of Iowa specifically, how is the energy, shortage or, high gas prices affecting the farmers in your state?
Well, people often don't connect high food prices with the lack of, gasoline production or oil and gas, but they're absolutely related. So the diesel that goes into tractors in order to both plant and plow and harvest. Natural gas is used for fertilizer production. Petrochemicals are used in the development of, pesticides and fungicides, our petrochemical industry. So there's a huge connection between oil and gas production and food prices. So just as gasoline prices are high, diesel prices are high, that relates to food prices. And then how do we transport food? We transport in trucks or rail cars or by barges on the Mississippi River. All of those costs have increased, which leads to increased food prices for you, the individual, when you go to the grocery store.
Another issue I'd like to ask you about how it's affecting Iowans. You typically wouldn't think that it does, but the issue of the southern border. How is that affecting a state that's not anywhere close to the southern border?
Well, I'm from Texas originally, interestingly enough, and so have had, encounters with illegal immigration. But what we're seeing at our border now is just unbelievable. There is an absolute crisis at the southern border. I made my first trip to the southern border last year as a member of Congress, and said at that time, people may wonder why somebody from Iowa is at the southern border. Interstate 35 runs the entire width of our country, and with Interstate 35 becomes drugs, illegal drugs, human trafficking, sex trafficking, and when you talk about humanity, more people have died crossing the southern border under this administration than under previous administrations. So it's an inhumane crisis not to control our southern border. We're enriching the cartels, but yes, they bring drugs, they bring human trafficking and sex trafficking, all of which is a burden to communities. We welcome immigrants. We want legal immigration. We want a controlled access to the southern border, but we need to stop the flow of drugs. We need to stop people coming across the border on the terror watch list, and we need to control our southern border.
Congresswoman, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The U.S. national debt has surpassed $31 trillion for the first time ever. It's been on a steep rise since the pandemic started.
The Treasury Department published data on Tuesday saying the U.S. national debt has surpassed $31 trillion for the first time in history. President Biden and Congress increased government borrowing during the COVID-19 pandemic in order to prop up the economy amid job losses and supply chain disruptions. Prior to the pandemic, at the end of 2019, the national debt stood at under $23 trillion. Just a year later, when former President Trump was still in office, it had risen to almost $28 trillion and has continued to add gains since. However, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget said in a Monday statement that the U.S. has now overcome the most severe challenges of the pandemic, but that the Biden administration continues to borrow huge amounts of money. As the committee put it, just in 2022, Congress and the President have approved a combined $1.9 trillion in new borrowing, and President Biden has approved $4.9 trillion in new deficits since taking office. We are addicted to debt. They say what's even more troubling than the debt itself is where it's heading, warning that excessive borrowing could see inflation skyrocket further and increase the national debt to a new record by 2030. They say government should commit to no further borrowing at least for the remaining 3 months of this year. In September, Biden pointed out how he reduced the budget deficit.
We're actually reducing the federal deficit. You know, they talk about responsible debt. The last guy left me with a giant deficit. Well, guess what? In my first year, I reduced the deficit by $350 billion.
We reached out to the White House for comment on the national debt and government borrowing, but didn't hear back before broadcast.
The value of Chinese companies on the 3 largest U.S. stock exchanges has dropped. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission regularly updates the list of companies. As of the end of September, there were 262 Chinese companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and NYSE American. These companies have a total market value of $775 billion. This is more than $500 billion lower than the end of June. And that's primarily because several major state-owned enterprises delisted in August. 2 Chinese state-owned enterprises remain listed on major U.S. exchanges. Following a new law on audit inspections, at least half of the Chinese companies are at risk of forced delistings. They represent 98% of the market value of Chinese companies listed on these exchanges. The number of murders last year in the United States rose. This is according to a new report by the FBI this week. The agency's report said that murders rose by 4.3% in 2021 to almost 23,000 people killed. That increase is in addition to the almost 30% rise in 2020. Justice Department officials said that the latest data for 2021 includes some estimates for incomplete data. Several key metropolitan areas, including New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, are transitioning to a new data collection system. The Department of Justice has been in the spotlight in recent months for a variety of reasons. A conservative nonprofit organization called Eagle Forum has just been issued a subpoena by the DOJ, raising concerns over First Amendment rights. Here to discuss, we have President of Eagle Forum, Chris Ullman. Chris Ullman, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
So happy to be with you today.
Chris, the Department of Justice has subpoenaed the nonprofit Eagle Forum, which you are the president of, over what sounds like a stance you guys took on a social issue. If you could, please explain.
Well, our Alabama chapter, Eagle Forum of Alabama, lobbied the legislature of Alabama to pass a law that would ban puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for kids under age 19. They went to the legislature. They said, "The problem. We'd like you to pass the law." The law was the product of the Alabama legislature. It was debated, passed, signed by the government, or the governor, and some parents on the other side sued, which is perfectly legal. They said it was a violation of their rights. Eagle Forum of Alabama is not a party to the lawsuit challenging the law in Alabama, but they were subpoenaed by the Department of Justice, which intervened into the case. And the Department of Justice wants the past 5 years of records of Eagle Forum of Alabama on anything having to do with the issue of gender dysphoria in children.
How do you think the DOJ decided to come after your chapter there in Alabama, and why should others be concerned? Does this raise bigger concerns and questions?
Well, Eagle Forum of Alabama was the leader in going to the legislature and pushing them to address this problem. They've been very out front on it. In the state of Alabama, they've never tried to hide it. It's on their webpage that they were pushing for this law. But we think the DOJ went after them because, well, Eagle Forum of Alabama disagrees with the federal government on what should be done regarding treatment for kids with gender dysphoria. And we believe that the Department of Justice wants to make an example out of a very small nonprofit group that is a lobbying group. It's a 501c4 lobbying group created to lobby their legislature. But they disagree with the administration, and therefore the administration is trying to harass them by forcing them to turn over all these documents, which are not at all relevant to the lawsuit, which DOJ is a party to.
Chris, to be clear, there was actually support from within the community as well to take on this issue prior to you or Eagle Forum getting involved.
Absolutely. Eagle Forum of Alabama heard from parents, teachers, doctors, counselors, that they were very concerned about these life-altering treatments. And that is why they brought the issue to the legislature. Both houses of the Alabama legislature passed this bill by over 80%. There was broad support for this bill. but we're concerned about the issue of DOJ subpoenaing a non-party to the lawsuit. Whether you're on the right or the left, you should be concerned that the DOJ will come after you if they disagree with your free speech rights, the position you've taken. The right to petition, the right to free speech, the right to assembly, all these rights are at issue in the case. The issue of puberty blockers is not really key to this case. What is key is that a nonprofit group is being targeted because the government does not like their stance on a particular issue, and they're trying to harass them into silence.
So with that said, Chris, what does this mean, or could this mean for your organization moving forward?
There's a hearing on October 14th where the judge will consider whether or not to throw the subpoena out. If he decides that the subpoena can stay, then Eagle Forum of Alabama will either have to turn over 5 years of their documents or will face contempt of court. What this means for other groups is, and we've heard from some of our other state leaders and other groups as well, that they fear getting involved in contentious issues because they fear they may be subpoenaed too, that their internal documents, that they will have to hire attorneys to even go through all their records, even if they wanted to comply. This is a very onerous process. And if you don't turn everything over, the government can hit you with a criminal contempt. So we're urging everyone, and we have over 60 groups that have spoken out in favor of our petition to quash the subpoena. Please speak up and say the DOJ does not have this right to harass nonprofit groups in this manner.
Chris Ullman, we really appreciate you coming on and speaking with us.
Thank you so very much.
And in the gubernatorial race in Arizona, Democratic candidate Katie Hobbs has declined to debate her Republican opponent, Kari Lake. Hobbs called Lake a conspiracy theorist. Here's how Lake responded.
Well, you know what? If that's what you think of me, then come sit on a debate stage and call me out. But she's afraid. Because we know that's not the real reason she won't debate me. The real reason is she has bankrupt ideas, dead-end ideas. She has a track record in the Senate that is abysmal. Her voting record is horrible. She voted against.
The Democrat Hobbs's campaign told local media, quote, Secretary Hobbs remains willing and eager to participate in a town hall-style event. Unfortunately, debating a conspiracy theorist like Kari Lake, whose entire campaign platform is to cause enormous chaos and make Arizona the subject of a national ridicule, would only lead to constant interruptions, pointless distractions, and childish name-calling. The Citizens Clean Elections Commission would have hosted the debate. The group rejected Hobbs's request for a town hall-style format. The latest polls show Lake and Hobbs in a dead heat. And SpaceX and NASA launched a crew of astronauts from across the world on a trip to the International Space Station. The rocket and spacecraft lifted off from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The 4 crew members include 2 NASA astronauts, an astronaut from Japan, and a cosmonaut from Russia. This is the first Russian cosmonaut to launch on an American spacecraft in nearly 20 years. The spacecraft is set to dock with the space station Thursday evening. The mission marks the 6th astronaut launch SpaceX has carried out in partnership with NASA, and it's the company's 8th manned flight overall.